Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting question that came from you, the learner. How do women's business networks, WBNs, actually help women advance their freedom in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question.
We've plunged into a stack of research, specifically this one detailed academic paper called Feminism in Women's Business Networks, a freedom-centered perspective to really try and get under the skin of this, our mission, to unpack it all, pull out the key insights, and, see what it actually means for understanding the modern workplace.
That's right. And to shed light on this, our main source is quite a fascinating study. Researchers analyzed a huge number of blog posts, 1529 actually.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, from 4 different women's business networks. And these weren't just, small local groups. They were based in the UK and the US, but had significant international reach.
Okay.
What's interesting is the diversity within them, too. These networks cater to, well, a really broad spectrum of women entrepreneurs, managers, women restarting careers, or even changing them completely.
So a real mix. How did the researchers even begin to analyze that much text?
Good question. They use some pretty sophisticated techniques. Topic modeling was one.
Right.
That helped them see the big picture, like what were the recurring themes across all those posts, kind of like finding the main plot points in a massive novel.
Okay, got it.
And then they use dialectical analysis. This let them dig deeper into the arguments and, crucially, the tensions or contradictions within those themes, uncovering the different viewpoints clashing or interacting.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because right off the bat, it feels like there's a bit of a tug of war happening here. You hear critics arguing that these WBNs often promote a very individualistic idea of freedom. Sometimes it's called post-feminist.
Right.
So when we say post-feminist, are we basically talking about a view that kind of assumes gender equality is maybe mostly achieved, and the focus shifts to individual success within the systems we already have?
That's a good way to put it. The concern from critics is that this focus on individual achievement might actually undermine the push for collective action needed to tackle those bigger systemic inequalities that are still very much present.
Yeah, I can see that tension. But this study we're looking at, it takes a different angle, doesn't it? It sort of reframes these WBNs.
Exactly. The study suggests we should see these WBNs, particularly their blogs, which is what they analyzed as political arenas.
Political arenas. Interesting.
Yeah, the very act of women coming together in these online spaces, making claims about their shared interests, their concerns. That act itself is viewed as a feminist practice of freedom. It's a form of what the paper calls world building.
World building.
Yeah, like a collective ongoing effort to understand and ultimately maybe reshape the world around them. So the big takeaway here is just what they're saying, but the fact that they are collectively articulating their experiences at all, that process is powerful.
That's a really interesting starting point. It shifts the focus. So let's dive into this post-feminism idea a bit more, specifically related to workplace freedom. What does that term really mean here, beyond that first definition?
Well, in the context of work, post-feminism often really emphasizes the individual woman's agency, her power to make choices. But critically, it sometimes seems detached from the broader social conditions that actually enable or, constrain those choices. A core idea you see is this concept of unforced choice.
Yeah.
Basically, the legal right to do something, even if the social realities, lack of childcare, cultural expectations, whatever, make it practically impossible for many women.
Right, I see. So on the surface, it sounds empowering. You have the freedom to choose. But the critique is, like you said, it can mask the fact that not everyone starts from the same place or has the same real opportunities because of those underlying conditions.
Precisely. And the critics of these post-feminist approaches within WBNs argue that by focusing so much on individual empowerment, things like, the whole lean-in idea Sheryl Sandberg popularized, these networks might inadvertently take the pressure off dismantling the deeper organizational and structural inequalities, the ones that continue to hold women back.
Yeah.
The focus becomes the individual woman overcoming barriers, rather than everyone working together to actually remove the barriers themselves.
That makes perfect sense. It's like the difference between giving one person a ladder to climb a wall versus everyone getting together to tear the wall down.
That's a great analogy.
So how does this contrast with other ways of thinking about freedom? The study mentions positive liberty. What's that about?
Positive liberty takes a different tack. It recognizes that social forces, even ones we've internalized, can really limit our freedom.
Okay.
So achieving true freedom isn't just about being left alone, the absence of external constraints. It requires a more active approach defining the content of our choices, engaging in shared governance. It often means collective action is necessary for real change and equality.
Okay, so moving beyond just being left alone to actively shaping a fairer world together. Now, the study brings in this other idea, Zarrilli's freedom-centered feminism. Sounds like we have these two contrasting views of freedom. How does Zarrilli's perspective help here? Does it bridge the gap or offer something new?
Yeah, Zarrilli's framework is really valuable here. It tries to move beyond what she sees as the limits of both the purely post-feminist view and maybe some more traditional feminist views. It puts a strong emphasis on plurality.
Plurality.
Yeah, the idea that politics is inherently about diverse perspectives coexisting. And it focuses on the ongoing public interaction involved in that world-building process we mentioned.
So it's less about finding one single perfect definition of freedom and more about the dynamic process of discussing it, shaping it constantly together.
Exactly that. Zarrilli sees freedom as a predicate of action. It's not just about having the will to do something, the I will, but also about the worldly conditions making it possible, the I can.
Right, the I can.
And crucially, she argues these enabling I can conditions are created through collective action within a political community.
Which brings us right back to WBNs as these political arenas. So with these different ideas about freedom floating around, can you elaborate on how the study sees these networks functioning in that way? It's not, Capitol Hill.
No, definitely not. The study argues these WBN blogs function as political arenas because they're public sites where women gather virtually to articulate claims about shared interests, concerns, experiences related to work.
Okay.
What's really crucial is how the study views the act of making these claims. Even if the claims are diverse, contradictory, maybe even post-feminist sometimes, the act itself is seen as a feminist practice of freedom.
Just the act of speaking up and claiming space.
Yes, and it's part of this world building. It's through that ongoing dialogue where claims can be answered, challenged, maybe transformed, that these networks become politically significant.
And to really get a handle on what was happening in these arenas, the researchers used a specific method, right? You mentioned topic modeling.
Yes, they used a qualitative methodology combining two key techniques. Topic modeling first, as we said, to map out the main themes across all those posts. Then dialectical analysis to zoom in on the claims being made around those themes, specifically looking for the tensions, the push and pull, the contradictions within those claims.
And they were quite careful about which WBN blogs they chose, weren't they? It wasn't just random.
Absolutely not. They had clear criteria. The networks needed both online and offline activities showing the blog was part of a bigger community.
Right.
They needed a history of regular blogging over years, giving them lots of data and diverse topics. The blogs also had to have practitioner or media attention, suggesting influence.
Okay, so they were known quantities.
Exactly. International reach, decent social media following, and importantly, they chose blogs where posts came from various network members, not just one person, to capture that diversity of voices.
Okay, so a really rich data set from influential, diverse platforms. Now, armed with these tools, what were some of the key tensions, these dialectics they found in how women were talking about freedom in these spaces? The study highlighted three. Let's start with the first, conformity and imagination. What's that about?
Okay, so this first dialectic, conformity and imagination, it really highlights this tension between, on one hand, reproducing existing gender norms in the workplace, and on the other, envisioning totally new possibilities for women's freedom.
Okay.
So conformity here means the ways a certain kind of feminine identity, one that fits the current gendered status quo, gets reproduced. It's often tied to a more traditional idea of freedom as like sovereignty being in control, but within the existing rules.
And what did that look like in practice in the blog posts? Any examples of this conformity?
Oh, definitely. The researchers found advice that just sort of assumed traditional gender roles were fixed. For instance, advice that implicitly put women's roles as mothers first,
Right.
suggesting work freedom could only happen if those duties were fulfilled first. There was also this thing called the cost-care calculus.
Cost-care calculus.
Yeah, they basically acknowledging that women still seem to carry the main load for domestic duties, even while chasing careers. There was this one evocative line about needing to walk over Lego when working from home.
Oh, boy. Yeah. I think many listeners can probably relate to that juggle.
I think so.
Yeah.
And the study also noted pressure to conform to specific versions of desirable femininity at work, like really detailed, sometimes quite restrictive rules about women's dress codes, for example.
So it's almost like fitting into a pre-made mold to gain acceptance and maybe freedom, but only within those existing boundaries. How does imagination push back against that?
Well, imagination, drawing on Zerilli, is seen as this critical feminist practice. It allows for redefining those boundaries, thinking beyond the accepted rules, creating new ways of being and acting. And this showed up too. There were blog posts challenging those norms head-on. For example, calls for women to proudly define our own style of motherhood, rejecting any single correct way.
That feels like a really powerful shift. Were there other examples of this imagination at play?
Absolutely. Some posts argued quite radically that equality is not a fight that has to happen within existing patriarchal structures, that women didn't need to constantly prove themselves on those terms.
Interesting. So redirect the energy.
Exactly. Redirect energy towards building something new. There were also really forward-thinking ideas like proposals for collective economic action, women actively investing in other women's businesses. One post just declared, "Game changed."
Wow.
They also found focus on women following their desires beyond family life, pointing to new investment approaches designed by and for women. And this was fascinating. Some posts slipped workplace norms using animal analogies, pointing out that in horse herds, the alpha is almost always female, directly challenging the assumed masculine default for leadership.
Huh. That's a brilliant way to reframe those ingrained ideas. Okay, that's conformity and imagination. Let's move to the second dialectic. Performative care and relational care. What's the difference there?
This dialectic explores the different ways care is talked about as a route to freedom for women. Performative care tends to emphasize individual agency, self-improvement. It aligns more with those post-feminist ideas of self-discipline, the belief that women can achieve freedom by optimizing themselves.
Right. And what did that look like in the blogs? What kind of advice fell under performative care?
You saw a lot of advice focused on personal development, self-help, things like diet tips, exercise regimes, time management hacks, mindfulness practices, building resilience, managing self-doubt, all framed as ways for women to become better leaders, better managers, better entrepreneurs, even better mothers. Titles like 5 Tips for Building Mindful Eating into Your Busy Day, or 4 Ways to Develop Your Resilience to Stress. Classic examples.
So the focus is very much on the individual woman needing to kind of fix herself or level up her life to get ahead. How does relational care contrast with that? It sounds different.
It's very different. Relational care takes a much broader view. It sees care as something happening through interactions with other people in a public space. It's about togetherness, reciprocity, solidarity. Not just the individual. It recognizes that freedom isn't only about your own will, the I will, but also your ability to act in the world, the I can, which inherently involves relationships.
And how did that sense of relational care show up in the WBN blogs?
Well, you saw claims about how important it is to help others, to share vulnerabilities. There was that sentiment, if you score, point to those who helped you.
Ah, nice. Acknowledging the collective.
Exactly. Recognizing and valuing others' contributions. There was also this strong feeling that by sharing journeys, being open about struggles, women create learning opportunities for each other. And maybe most powerfully, there was this vision of women creating entirely new kinds of work environments. Ones based on trust and joy, explicitly rejecting those old top-down hierarchies and, me-first competition. As one post boldly stated, this is a women's network based on trust and joy.
Wow. Trust and joy. That's a really potent idea, isn't it? Actively building a supportive community, not just trying to survive the existing one.
It's a really powerful contrast, yeah. Moving from just optimizing yourself to collectively supporting each other and even reimagining the structures themselves.
Okay, so that brings us to the third and final dialectic identified, sameness and openness. What's the core tension here? This sounds like it touches on inclusivity.
It absolutely does. This dialectic, sameness and openness, tackles that crucial issue. Sameness refers to claims that often implicitly assume all WBN members are basically alike, usually centering the experiences of, a white, middle-class, often post-feminist subject.
Right.
And the problem is, this can unintentionally hide important differences and end up reinforcing existing privileges.
And how did this assumption of sameness actually play out in the blog post? Can you give examples?
Sure. They saw discussions about, say, women's common interests in finance, like impact investing. But these were often presented without really acknowledging the huge differences in economic realities women face globally.
Yeah. Big differences.
Or personal stories about career challenges that just sort of assumed a middle-class background, maybe referencing a daily latte habit or similar lifestyle markers.
Little things that signal a specific background.
Exactly. And even sometimes in calls for allyship, women of color might still be positioned as somehow outside the main WBN group, with the focus maybe being on unconscious bias training rather than tackling deeper structural issues.
So a potential blind spot where one group's experience gets treated as the default, obscuring the diversity of other women's realities. How does openness try to counter this?
Openness represents the deliberate efforts to push beyond that typical post-feminist subject. It involves actively acknowledging and engaging with the real, empirical differences within and beyond these networks. This might mean explicitly defining and discussing concepts like intersectionality, recognizing how identities like race, class, gender overlap to create unique experiences of marginalization. They even found posts referencing Kimberly Crenshaw's definition directly.
That's a really important step towards a more inclusive idea of freedom. Were there other ways this openness showed up?
Yes, definitely. They saw examples of integrating diverse cultural perspectives and concepts. One example mentioned was using brata from Jamaican vernacular, meaning a little extra.
Oh, interesting.
There was also a conscious effort to highlight a diverse set of role models women celebrated for varied achievements, who maybe didn't fit the mold of being well-behaved, challenging narrow definitions of success. Think Maya Angelou, Eleanor Roosevelt, Gloria Steinem, Mae Jemison mentioned together.
Wow, quite a range.
Yeah. And some posts explicitly acknowledged the variety of experiences within women's networks. And crucially, there were direct invitations for broader participation, asking diverse women to help define what freedom even means. One quote was something like, "I would love to hear what other women are doing around the world to claim our daughters' freedom."
So actively trying to widen the conversation, it feels like these three tensions, conformity versus imagination, performative versus relational care, sameness versus openness, they really capture the core challenges and possibilities within these networks, don't they?
I really do.
Navigating individual dreams versus systemic change, balancing self-reliance with community, striving for real inclusivity. It paints such a complex, sometimes contradictory picture of how freedom is being worked out in these WBNs. So pulling it all together, what are the main takeaways from the study as a whole?
I think the study's really key contribution is its perspective. It argues that the very act of making claims within these WBN blogs, whether those claims seem post-feminist or radically challenge the status quo, that act itself can be seen as a form of political action, action that has the potential to advance women's freedom.
Potential being the key word.
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's crucial to understand that progress isn't guaranteed. The outcomes of these online interactions are unpredictable. They could lead to transformation, sure, but they could also end up just reinforcing existing norms.
So it's dynamic, it's ongoing, no fixed outcome.
Exactly. The study really emphasizes how important it is to engage in democratic deliberation, to be open to lots of different perspectives if we really want to foster that world building we talked about. Ultimately, I think this deep dive really highlights this incredibly dynamic, often messy and contradictory ways women are negotiating freedom in the workplace through these networks. And it shows that even spaces that might seem focused only on individual careers can actually become really significant sites for political engagement, maybe collectively imagining new possibilities.
This has been genuinely insightful, really digging into the nuances of these networks and what freedom means in that context. To just wrap things up then, what are the main points we've hit today?
Well, we've taken a deep dive into how these women's business networks, especially through their blogs, really function as active spaces. Spaces where ideas about women's freedom are constantly being debated, contested, and shaped. We look at that core tension between individualistic approaches, focusing on the self, and more collective approaches to achieving freedom. We explored the different ways care gets understood as a self-improvement or community support. And we talked about the vital, ongoing challenge of inclusivity, of recognizing and valuing the diverse experiences of all women within these networks.
Yeah, that really covers it. And finally, as you reflect on all this, what's a thought you'd want to leave our listener, the learner, with? Something to chew on as they navigate their own professional lives and communities.
Maybe consider the communities you're part of, online or offline. Whose voices tend to get amplified in those spaces? What assumptions about freedom, about success, are just sort of there under the surface?
Good question.
And then think, How could these very spaces be used not just to help individuals climb the ladder, but maybe to collectively envision and actually start building a more equitable world for everyone? After this deep dive, what claims might you start making or listening for or engaging with differently?